introduce yourself and go.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name's Liz Floyd. I work for Hampshire SENDIASS. I have been working for Hampshire SENDIASS for about 2.5 years, and before that I used to be a volunteer. So I used to be an independent parent supporter and go around to people's houses and help them fill out EHC plan application forms. So we do a lot about EHC plans, and that's why you're here. So that's me. I expect a lot of you want to know what an EHC plan is. Lots of people say EPH plan, ECP plan, but it's actually an education, health and care plan. So it's an EHC plan, just to be clear. Okay, so that means that it incorporates provision for education, and also if there is a need for provision for social care or healthcare that affects education, then that will also be in the EHC plan. So that's that. I hope you understand that. Sorry. There we go. Sorry. So the aim of this session is for you to hopefully by the end of it understand the process and all the ins and outs of it, time frames, etc., etc. The purpose of an EHC plan is to gather information about a child's needs. Those needs are assessed during the assessment process, and then eventually the provision that has been recommended by the professionals involved will be written into an EHC plan. Okay, and the local authority will generally only do an assessment if they feel that the school can't meet needs without it. So if they feel that the needs can be met without it, they will try and follow that path first before they decide to issue an EHC plan. Okay, so the first stage is to go onto the hub. Now, the hub has been running for about 2 years. Before that, it was very much filling out forms and submitting them via email. That can still be done. I'd just like to say that. It can still be done by post, and there are still some families that don't have computers or for whatever reason feel the need to put in an application by post, and that's still okay. It's just worth pointing out that the majority of applications now should be done through the hub. Okay, and so I haven't got a link on here for the hub, but either HPCN or Hampshire SENDIASS can furnish you with a link if necessary. So once you get onto the link and get onto the hub, you make a request for an EHC Needs Assessment, and it asks you a series of questions, and that is to determine what help you're already getting or your child is already getting at school. Okay, and then the next stage is they decide whether or not to do an assessment. The next stage is the EHC Needs Assessment itself. Then that normally takes quite a long time, and we'll talk about timeframes in a minute. And then there's the completion of the EHC Needs Assessment, and then they issue a draft plan, or if they decide not to issue an EHC plan, they might issue notes of Sen, which is otherwise known as a non-statutory EHC plan, which is a bit of a misnomer, and we'll talk about that if necessary, but I don't want to go off on a tangent. And then finally they issue the plan. So that's the stages, and you will find that it's very procedural, and it's best to approach it in a procedural way as well. Okay, so the first thing is when you request an assessment, normally this is triggered by a sort of building history of needs not being met in school for whatever reason. They might have done some else to support, they might have put reasonable adjustments in place, they might have even brought in an EP or someone from specialist outreach to come into the school, and hopefully they will have documented this as well. And this builds up a bit of a picture, and if the child's needs are not being met after doing all of those things and exhausting the SEN support process, then that would be the cue to apply for an EHC plan. So as I said before, requests can be made online or by post, and after the online request has been made, you will be invited to register on the EHC hub. And then once you've registered, you should be able to access the hub thereafter. And the idea is you can check up on updates. So if the school have updated the information, you should be able to see it on there. If the LA have updated any information, and it will also have information of your caseworker as well on there if you need to contact them. Okay, so through the hub, the local authority will contact you to inform you that they are either going to carry out an assessment or the process of the assessment and the timescales as well. And they will also tell you the name of your caseworker, and that you have 29 days to send in written evidence and to upload evidence onto the hub. And they will also give you information about any other services, including ourselves. Okay, so that's the first step. They will then inform you of their decision of whether to assess or not within 6 weeks. So what they do is they look at all the information that's been uploaded, and this could be information such as the R story, which is otherwise known as the K1. It can also be evidence from school, evidence from external professionals. It could be evidence from CAMS, GP, anything that is relevant really to the case and that has worked with the child. If they, I mean, with regards to deciding whether or not to assess or not, if they feel that the school could still do a bit more, or if they feel that there's not enough evidence, they might decide not to assess. And if they do, then you will be given the reasons why. And it's important, and this is why I say it's procedural, at this stage, you can appeal that decision, and that is called appealing refusal to assess. That's a refusal to assess appeal. And if you decide to appeal that, then it's generally done on the papers, which means it doesn't go through to a hearing. So I don't want to focus on that too much because this isn't about appeals today, but I just wanted to let you know that if that is a decision you get back, a decision not to assess, then you can appeal that. And you can also call us, of course, at Hampshire SENDIASS if that happens to you. Okay, so if they agree to do the assessment and the assessment's underway, they will write to you to tell you so, and they will start gathering information for the assessment. And that information covers information from yourselves as parents, information wherever possible from the child or young person, and obviously each child or young person might have their own needs. There might be some that are non-verbal, so it's a case of getting a trusted adult to gather their views in whichever way is most appropriate. They might gather the views from an educational psychologist, a doctor, social worker, or any other organisations that have worked with you, your family or your child. Okay, so that part of the process takes quite a long time. Okay, the first portion takes about 6 weeks. This portion takes a minimum of 14 weeks and often longer. And then when they have made their decision, after they've gathered all that evidence up, they will then decide whether or not to issue a plan. Okay, the LA should inform you or the young person, if they're over 16, of their decision within 16 weeks of beginning the EHC Needs Assessment. Okay, and they will either issue a draft plan or, oh, hang on a sec. I don't know if you can hear that. Can you hear that ringing? Sorry, I forgot to come out of the helpline. Hold on a sec.
No, not really. It's fine.
You can't hear it. Oh, that's all right then. That's the main thing. It's just distracting for me. Right, well, hopefully it won't ring again. Right, so next bit. Right, I just wanted to say, and there's probably some eye rolling then, actually, when the 16 weeks is often, it often goes over, sadly. Very frequently we're finding, sadly, in Hampshire that it is going over the statutory time frame, which is altogether 20 weeks, 6 weeks for the first bit, 14 weeks or 16 weeks for the next bit, and quite often it goes beyond that. And Hampshire are aware of that, and they are trying to improve the system, I think, but it does seem to happen quite a bit. Okay, so you can read information about the process on our website, and obviously if anybody wants to ask any questions at this point about applying for an EHC plan, I'm all ears.
We've not got any at the moment, Liz.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
You're covering everything for the minute. I'm sure we'll have some in a bit.
Okay, well, how about then if I've got another slideshow that I want to cover, which is about when you get an EHC plan. Does that sound?
I've had a question pop in though at just this moment, Liz.
Okay, fire away.
Is there such a thing as an application for an emergency EHCP plan?
So there is. Okay, so there is something called an assessment place. Okay, so if there is a very compelling reason why the child or young person must have an EHC plan as soon as possible, then you can request an assessment place. You would make this request directly to the SEN team and to the SEN team for your area. So if you lived in Hart and Rushmore, you would apply to the SEN team in Hart and Rushmore, and, you know, same with any other area of the county. And they will give it consideration. What I can say is that it's quite difficult to get an assessment place. It has to be extremely compelling reasons. Otherwise, you do have to go through the motions, I'm afraid, a little bit, because in England, it is the law to have, you have to have an EHC plan in order to get a place in a special school. They have on occasions, and they do on occasions, if a process is underway and they've agreed to assess and it's very likely they're going to issue a plan, and a place might have been offered or reserved for this child or young person, then it is possible that they might place them there pending the EHC plan. So sometimes things can be done, but it normally requires a direct conversation with SEN, and probably a more senior special needs officer would need to deal with that.
I'm trying to think of sort of scenarios, and the one that's occurred to me is that, you know, if a child is involved in a life-changing occurrence, either physically or in terms of their cognitive ability, then something is going to need to take place really quickly, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, you know, you would pursue the assessment place really. And there are also, you know, in terms of things like accidents and things like that, there are hospital schools as well, which is a particularly niche section of placements, but that might be worth looking in that direction. But again, a child does need an EHC plan, but quite often sometimes they move from hospital to a hospital school, and the process of applying for an EHC plan might take place in the hospital to start off with, and then they might move across. So
I think it's important to reiterate what you said in the beginning, that you don't need an EHCP to access support from school, do you?
No, and I really would like to talk about that a little bit, actually, because there is a huge amount of applications for EHC plans, and there is quite a lot that schools can do to support children in school. We talk about this a lot through triage at Hampshire SENDIASS. Many parents phone us up and say, you know, their child is refusing to attend school, or they don't feel supported in school, they don't feel safe, they're running off, they're volatile in the classroom, they're tipping over a table, or there's all sorts of different scenarios. What would need to happen, and again, it's very good to have a procedural approach to this, is first of all, you need to have a conversation with the school. And I know that sounds really obvious, but you need to have a conversation first with the class teacher, and then maybe the SENCO. Each primary school or secondary school is different, and they are different between primary and secondary as well. That, you know, the structure, the staffing structure, and who you would go to. But you would start off speaking to the school, determine what the needs are, and they ought to have regard for your views and wishes, and they ought to follow best practices, to follow the SEN code of practice, which which is following what they call a graduated approach, assess, plan, do, review approach, which means to assess the child's needs, and that assessment of needs is consulting with parents. It's also consulting with external professionals if necessary. So there are special schools scattered throughout the country that do offer outreach support to mainstream schools. There is also, for primary, there is the PBS service, the Primary Behaviour Support Service. So if the child is displaying behaviour that's very distracting, quite volatile in the classroom, then the school can make a referral to the PBS and they can receive some either in-reach or outreach support from the PBS. And that would spring from a conversation with the school. Also, they can make reasonable adjustments. I mean, there are quite a few things that they can do there. Sometimes some children find the beginning of the day very difficult, for example. It might be best to allow them to come into class first before the others, or a bit later than the others. And these are what are called reasonable adjustments, or providing more comfort breaks for children with ADHD that need to run off a bit of steam. You know, things like that would be expected to be provided really in mainstream school, even without an EHC plan. So that's SEN support generally. Sometimes it's quite a good idea to formalise, I suppose, or make it more robust in the form of a support plan. And these can be called all sorts of things. They can be called individual education plans, provision mapping, personal learning plans, behaviour support plans, whatever they call it. The idea is to incorporate that assess, plan, do, review. So assess those needs, if necessary, using external professionals, incorporate the provision recommended by those professionals, and incorporating the views of the teaching staff and the parents, and incorporating that into a plan, and then actually implementing the plan consistently and have it overviewed by the SENCO of the school. And then for that plan to be reviewed on a regular basis. And they call this assess, plan, do, review. And sometimes when parents apply for EHC plans and they get refused, often they will say there's not enough evidence or there's not enough cycles of assess, plan, do, review. So it's really critical there that these things are documented, first of all. These reasonable adjustments, these IEPs, learning plans are documented and reviewed, because that will provide really good evidence if you do decide to apply for an EHC plan.
Something else I hear, Liz, said frequently, but by your colleagues, where there's a young person who's masking at school and coming home and displaying things at home, it's really, really valuable to keep a diary at home of what is happening, because obviously school can't evidence that because it's not happening at school, but because they're having to mask and the energy that's taking out at school and behaviours coming out at home, the evidence isn't necessarily at school's fingertips. So that's something else that
yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And I think the latest SEN support for school guidance, which was published I think in February this year, it goes into more detail in the more operational side of things of assess, plan, do, review. So like I say, it's guidance for schools, and sometimes when you are talking to schools and you're finding it a little bit difficult to get that support, it's well worth referring to that document, because it's very easy, it's more applicable to the situation. And it does say in there about, it's not just about learning gaps, it's about learning needs. So there doesn't need to be, you can get a child with SEN that is struggling in school and still be keeping up with their schoolwork and masking and seemingly coping, and then they go home and they disintegrate. And we hear that a lot from parents. And what I would say as well, the PBS, whilst what I discussed earlier under SEN support, they do this as an education referral, and the school would need to make that referral. The PBS also do have another arm to their service, which is a newer thing, which is the Wellbeing Support Service. This is for primary age children, and this is a health referral. So if you're concerned about your primary age child's mental health, then you could ask the GP to make a referral to the PBS Wellbeing Support Service. It's county-wide. There are other initiatives in the county as well alongside that. So if you lived in Havant, Gosport areas, they are running a pilot at the moment, and they have an MHST, which is the mental health support team based in schools. So they come to the schools and the school make a referral. So that's a slightly separate thing for Havant and Gosport, Waterlooville families, but it's worth bearing that in mind. If you're not sure, if you didn't catch that, what I said, then please do call us at Hampshire SENDIASS and we can enlighten you a bit more about that. But yeah, I hope that covers that.
That supporting needs concept sort of comes to the next question I've got as well, which is, do children usually have a diagnosed condition to apply for an EHCP, or is the diagnosis something that comes in the fullness of time?
Okay, well, good question. Well, first of all, just to put this out there, you do not need a diagnosis for an EHC plan, and you do not need a diagnosis for accessing SEN support. So that's just the first thing I wanted to put out there. So it's a needs-based process. So if you feel that your child is not being supported in school and you've gone through the SEN support and it seems like the child still needs an EHC plan, there doesn't have to be, waiting for a diagnosis to trigger the process. And that's a really important thing that it sometimes does get bandied about sometimes, but it's really not the case. You don't need a diagnosis. What you find further down the line, though, is a diagnosis can be helpful if you were in a position where you were choosing or looking at specialist schools. Then it becomes a little bit more relevant because it directs you in the right direction of school. So that's when a diagnosis is kind of helpful.
It's a tricky one, isn't it? I often have parents who come along to my get-togethers who are in that point of trying to get a diagnosis in order to get the support, but actually the support should come with or without the diagnosis because it's based on the need, and needs don't change as a rule.
Exactly, and I think it's a really good reference point. Really good reference point. It's always, what is the needs of the child? Have that as the reference point, and you go needs, provision, and then placement, and it's always in that order. What are their needs first? And that's why the process is in that order. It's let's determine what the needs are. Let's speak to professional people to recommend the right provision for that child, and then let's choose the placement that can provide that provision.
The other thing to bear in mind, isn't it, is that a diagnosis doesn't mean two children are the same either, or that their needs are the same. And
No.
it's something that comes up often on my get-togethers, is parents discussing, well, you've got a child with X and so have I, so which schools would you recommend? And it's a tricky one because those schools might be right for both families, but they might not. And one child might be getting X provision, but that doesn't mean another child with the same diagnosis would get X provision.
Exactly. There are many children with comorbidities, of ADHD, ASD, OCD, PDA. There's all sorts of impairments out there that live alongside each other. And so that is exactly why it's a needs-based process, and it isn't hung just on a diagnosis. Yeah.
Okay. I think we've gone through my questions for the moment.
Okay, so should we talk about, I don't know if there's anyone here that has an EHC plan at all already, or maybe have been sent a draft plan or anything like that.
I don't know if people can stick hands up or put something. I haven't got many pictures, so stick something in, just a thumbs up in chat or something, so that we can know whether people have got diagnoses. So I've got a yes to an EHCP. My daughter's got an EHCP, so I'm in the camp of having been through this. In fact, we started with a statement, transition from a statement to an EHCP between infants and juniors, and I've just done the transition from juniors to secondary. Yeah.
So you're veteran. A veteran. Okay, so this little slideshow here is just explains what's in an EHC plan. So when you get it delivered, so you've gone through this whole long process, which probably most likely has taken longer than 20 weeks. You will get the EHC plan, and you might think, what the hell does this mean? It's split into sections, and this presentation here will just explain a little bit about what each section means. Okay, so oh, sorry, my phone's just making really bizarre noise. Okay, so if the LA decide to issue a plan, they will issue a draft plan for you to comment on. So that's the first stage. So they will normally send you a letter saying, we have issued a plan, please refer to the plan on the EHC hub, is what they will probably do. And you will then go onto the hub to view the draft plan, and you are given 15 days to respond to that draft plan. So some parents are like, oh, I've been waiting months and months for this thing, and now they only give me 2 weeks. But you can reasonably ask them to extend it if you need it extended. But the reason why they give you a couple of weeks to review the plan is that obviously they want to get to the point of finalising the plan, and they don't want it to take longer than it needs to, or longer than it has already. But it's important to really look at the plan, read it thoroughly, and make sure there's nothing important that's been missed off. Okay, and so we would suggest that the best thing to do is to read it in conjunction with the reports that informed the plan. Okay, so they are normally, you will probably have copies of EP reports and CAMS reports and things like that. No doubt you've got bulging files full of all this stuff, but the reports will be put on the appendices, probably on the hub. There's a section on the hub where all the evidence is being stored, and it's good to look at your draft plan alongside these reports. So if you have an EP report, have the EP report on one side and the draft on the other, and go through it systematically to make sure that there hasn't been anything missed in translation. Because what happens is that the reports are submitted to SEN, and then they write the EHC plan, so you can make sure they haven't missed anything off important. Okay, you also need to see whether you agree with what they say. Have they incorporated your views into it? Your views should be present there on that plan, as should your child's views, or the young person's views ought to be present on that plan. It should be a representation of your child or yourself if you're over 16. And there's 3 responses to a draft plan. The first one is to accept it and sign it off. The second one is to say, well, I'd actually like to make an amendment because I don't agree with that and I don't agree with that. Or the other one is to request a meeting. Okay, and you can, if there's quite a bit you'd like to change, or if there's quite a bit wrong with it, it's sometimes good to discuss this in a meeting with SEN. And if you do ask that, you have to expect there to be a time delay on the publication of the final plan. That's all. So that will extend that time frame up to a maximum of 45 days before you might get the final plan back. Okay, so that is that. So that's reviewing a draft plan, and we at Hampshire SENDIASS, we would happily talk it through with you over the phone. Some people, if they're really struggling, we can ask one of our volunteers to look at a draft plan, because it takes quite a long time to look through it. So we would normally allocate that task to a volunteer who, we have some fantastic volunteers that look through lots of EHC plans, and they can review it for you. But we would encourage you, though, to have a stab at it yourself by using our reviewing a draft plan document that's on our website. Okay, and if you're not sure, obviously just call us at any time. Okay, so, oh, there we go. So the child's parent or young person has the right to request a particular school at this stage as well when you get the draft plan. So once you've reviewed it and you've made sure everything's okay, you also then request a school. Now, one thing to look out for, sometimes people get to this stage, they get the plan, the draft plan, and then they go, oh my God, I've got 2 weeks to look at schools. Okay, that's quite a common phone call we get. And so I would always encourage people, if they're applying for an EHC plan, once that EHC plan is off and submitted, or certainly once you've perhaps when they've told you they're going to do an assessment, then maybe that would be the time to look at schools, do your homework. And again, Hampshire SENDIASS, we can send out information about schools if you want to find out a bit more about that. So just be aware of that 15 days time is often not enough to look at schools, but you will find some special schools. They won't want you to look around the school until they see a final plan. So that can sometimes be a bit of a catch-22 situation, but cross that bridge when you get to it. And if it's a problem, give us a call and we'll advise you accordingly, I would say, with that. So out of schools, there are mainstream maintained schools, and very often the local authority will suggest or will always go for this as a default option, unless obviously in the EHC plan there's compelling evidence that points towards a more specialist provision. Okay, but very often local authorities are keen to place in mainstream, and this is because it is a child's right in the UK for a place in a mainstream school, and so it's very important that this is offered to them. So it's not just because the LA want to save money or anything like that. It is also because every child in the UK has a right to a maintained school. So, but if their needs are greater than what a maintained mainstream school can provide, then it's perfectly reasonable to look at a maintained special school or a resourced provision. So a resourced provision is a unit, often with a specialism, that is attached to a mainstream school. So it can be an ASC unit, it could be a SEMH unit, which for those that don't know all these acronyms, ASC is autistic spectrum condition, SEMH is social, emotional, mental health. Some units also have hearing impairment, visual impairment, and dyslexia, for example. So we have a list that we can send out, and there is also a list you can access on the local offer of all these different schools. The next, and then of course you've got special schools, on from resource provision, which is, and again, they will have specialism. So very often they are speech, language and communication, or they're ASD, /MLD, which is moderate learning difficulties. There are also schools for severe learning difficulties, and there are also some more specialist ones, physical disabilities. Some go from age 2 to 18 or 19, some are primary age, some are secondary age. So there is a real selection. And then there are independent sector, and we do get quite a few inquiries about this, Sarah, as well. Independent schools. So you are within your right to name whatever school you want, really, on an EHC plan. That doesn't mean to say you will get it, but the local authority have to have regard for your wishes. So you can request an independent school, but if you do request an independent school, the onus is on you to prove that that school is the best school for your child and can meet needs, whereas another one couldn't. So you would be expected to provide evidence to show that this school could meet your child's needs. And so
I'll pop in with a question there, Liz.
Yeah.
It links onto something, a little chat I've had on the side with a parent on the call who has just received an EHCP for a child who's currently in a mainstream setting. The mainstream setting is saying that they can't meet needs, but that the mainstream school is the school that's been named in the EHCP as the placement. The parents are naming a specialist school, Clayhill and Coxley's, which I think is
it's a section 41 school down in the New Forest. So there's two sites. There's Clayhill and Coxley's, and one is SEMH and one is SC.
So in terms of a parent getting a school like that named in a plan when a mainstream school has been named and that particular mainstream school says they can't meet needs? What is the process?
So the process is you can challenge that decision. You can go to appeal. I mean, first of all, if the mainstream school is saying that they can't meet need, then that is an advantage in your request, I would say. If they said that they could meet need, that would be slightly more trickier for you.
Meet need, how have they been named in the EHCP?
Well, I don't know, because they should have been sent a consultation and they would have said whether or not they could meet need. If it transpires that they get put on a plan, that would be a question for SEN, not me. But, you know, ultimately...
So I think they are on a plan. The mainstream school has been named as the placement.
But they feel they can't meet need. Yeah. So what they would then need to do is to consider appealing. So in order to appeal, you need to have considered mediation. Now, warning, this is kind of quite pedantic, but for anyone to appeal, you have to have considered mediation. You don't have to have a mediation meeting, but you have to consider it at least. And if you want to go straight to appeal, you'll get issued a mediation certificate and you don't have to do the meeting if you don't want to. But sometimes it is worth doing a mediation because sometimes the LA might have indicated that there's some wiggle room there maybe, or it might be because you think that you've got new evidence to show that since they've decided to name that mainstream school, some new evidence has come in that you think is quite compelling and you might be able to overturn their decision in a mediation meeting. So for some people it's an advantage and it actually, they can get things sorted at mediation level and not need to proceed to an appeal. So it saves time. And for other people, they feel it's just going to delay the process. They don't feel like they're going to get much luck through mediation, so they will proceed to appeal. But it is important, you have to have the evidence to prove why you think that this school that you want can meet needs and the school that's been named can't. And
I know we didn't want to get into the whole appeal thing today.
No.
We have done a SENDIASS session on appeals at some point in the past, and I will try and find a link to it and stick it in the chat. Yeah,
it is definitely another rabbit hole to go down, which perhaps will take us off on a tangent. But I would say if you're in that situation and the school have said they can't meet needs, well, first of all, that's one thing in your advantage if the school have said they can't meet need, because I'm sure they'd be happy to say it again in a more formal arrangement. But if you want particular advice about that case, I would contact Hampshire SENDIASS.
To overrule the school. So if the school says we can't meet needs, can Hampshire say, well, we think you can and you haven't explored these options?
Yes, I think they do that, and I think they can do that, and I think sometimes that's why we do see them naming schools when schools have said they can't meet need. And also, if in a case where SEN support, if they feel that SEN support hasn't been thoroughly explored, I think they would quite likely turn around and say we've decided to not. They might not get to the stage of having done an assessment though. They might have decided that at an earlier stage, and they might have decided not to assess at all, because it is quite unusual actually to decide to go to an assessment and not issue a plan. That is less frequent in the calls that we get anyway, but it does happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, I interrupted your train of thought there.
No, not at all. I didn't know if there was any other questions about that.
I think we've covered that bit.
Okay. One thing I didn't say was about just to explain about independent schools. So there are some what they call Section 41 schools. So there's special maintained schools, and they are maintained by the local authority. And then there are Section 41 independent specialist provisions, and they are on a Section 41 list, which means, and it might sound complete gobbledygook, but it means that they've agreed to adhere to some elements of the Children and Families Act and the SEN Code of Practice, and they will take referrals from the local authority if they feel that they can meet need. So they still have to say that they can meet need in order for a child to be sent there. But often Section 41 schools are used if a maintained school cannot, if they can't find a maintained special school with a place, or they can't find one that can meet need because the case is very particular and very specific and there's not a maintained option for them, they might place in an independent school, and they would quite often look to a Section 41 school first. Okay, and they are a lot more money, so they cost the local authority a lot more money, but they will consider placing a child there if the need is there.
Is it worth saying, Liz, that if you're in that position, you don't need to just look in Hampshire? Well, in fact, that's true of schools, full stop, isn't it? You can look.
Yeah,
it's wise to look close to where you are. I'm in Hart and Rushmore, so
so you're Surrey, close to Surrey.
In by Berkshire and Surrey,
yeah.
and so I know a lot of children who do cross the borders.
Yes, so all it is it's just another layer, really, that adds another layer onto the process. So it's perfectly okay to request a school over the county border, either a maintained school or a Section 41 school. But what it means is that, so in the case of naming a maintained special school over the county border, there has to be a conversation between the two local authorities. So, for example, if you wanted a school in Surrey and you lived in Hampshire, you had an EHC plan, and this school happens to be closer, because that often happens. A Surrey school might be closer to you than the nearest maintained suitable Hampshire special school. If that's the case, then they totally can send a consultation to that school, and the school, if they have a place, or they can offer a place, and the local authority Hampshire would have to give the money across to the Surrey local authority for that place to be given to a Hampshire child. So there's just one extra move on the chessboard, I suppose.
But it's important to know, isn't it, that if your child lives in Hampshire, they will have a Hampshire EHCP. If they go into a Surrey school, they will still have a Hampshire. EHCP.
They will, yeah, they will. And there was one other thing I was going to say about that. It's quite likely, I don't know if this is exclusively so, but I think it is the case that a Surrey, if you were in Hampshire and applied for a place in a Surrey school, then Surrey would prioritise their own residents over the Hampshire residents. But it is a needs-based process, so, it might be, if you were in that situation and you didn't agree with the decision, you could possibly look at that and say, but it's a needs-based process, and arguably my child's needs are greater than that Surrey child's needs. I suppose you could, if you were going down that, if you were pursuing that appeal route, that could be something that you might want to look at.
I think the other thing that happens is that you're a Hampshire parent and you know the Hampshire system, and my experience of people crossing boundaries is that sometimes the process in Surrey or Berkshire is then slightly different, and it's not a process that you're familiar with.
Yeah, and transport is another one as well. Yeah. So when you're arranging transport for, so if you're in a Surrey school, I'm saying Surrey in Hampshire, but it obviously doesn't have to be Surrey, but I'm just using that as an example. If your child was going to be attending a Surrey school and you've been given transport, the process is slightly different for arranging transport. So the SEN team would have to organise the transport, whereas if that special school was in Hampshire, if you'd chosen a Hampshire school, then that school in Hampshire would contact the transport team directly. But if your school is in Surrey, then the SEN team have to talk to the transport team via your Surrey school.
I'm sure we could do a whole session on transport. And I don't want I don't want to go down that rabbit hole.
There's so many rabbit holes.
An easy question, I hope, because I think it's a yes/no question, is do EHC plans cover transport?
Well, there is a section in when you apply for an EHC plan where you get the opportunity to say what your child or young person's abilities are in terms of getting around. So if they need a chaperone, for example, or if they just simply couldn't entertain the thought of going on a bus, you know, this indicates to the local authority whether a bus or a taxi is more suitable, and sometimes they have to come up with more bespoke arrangements depending on the needs. Yeah. And also that, sorry, I was just going to say as well, if the school is named in the plan, if you get the school named in the plan and they agree that it's the nearest suitable school, then you will get transport automatically.
Oh, let me just process that one.
You process. Yes.
Oh,
I did get, and the emphasis on the words nearest suitable.
Yes. Because my next thought was that I hear people being told that, yes, we can name that school, but almost you have to agree to forego transport. I've heard.
Well, yes.
That.
So okay. So first of all, one thing, post 16, not the case. Between 16 and 19, not the case. Don't ask me why. It's just not the case. So you can't get transport even if you've got an EHC plan between the ages of 16 and 19.
Is it a can't, or is it that you have to pay?
Oh, sorry, yeah, you have to pay.
Okay.
You have to pay for it. You don't get it free, sorry, yeah. Is what I should have said. Thank you. Yeah, and the other thing about what you mentioned just before then, Sarah, about, so for example, if you chose 2 mainstream schools and one was a bit further away than the other, and the local authority agreed to name your choice of school, but they felt that the other one could meet need as well and happened to be a bit closer, they might decline paying for the transport in favour of, you know, saying, okay, if you agree to take your child into school, then we will name your choice on the plan as long as you agree to take them, because we think there's a nearer suitable school that can take that could take your child, but you've chosen the one slightly further away. And in that case, you might forego your transport.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay.
So are we clear with the transport?
Let's not go any further on transport. We will be here all afternoon.
Okay. Okay. So, sorry, where were we? So that was schools. So we've talked about independent schools. We've talked about maintained schools, maintained special schools, and resourced provision as well. So I don't know if anybody else wants to ask anything else about
I think we've
schools.
Covered all the bits we've got at the moment. I mean, as you know, there's so many rabbit holes, and people can potentially have quite individual and quite specialist things. And I would also say, go and talk to Liz at the team at SENDIASS if you have a, you know.
Yeah. I would also say as well, age 19, if you've got an EHC plan, you're back to being able to get free transport again. So there is a age 16 to 19 issue there, if you want free transport. So I'm just putting that out there. Okay, so notes of SEN. So this is when the local authority decide to, they don't think they're not going to issue a plan, but instead they're going to issue this notes of SEN, or sometimes it's called a non-statutory plan, or sometimes it's called an SEN support plan. And what they do is they put it in sections, they explain what provision is needed, they interpret some of those reports, but it's not an actual plan and it's not a legally binding document like an EHC plan. So if anybody gets that, just be aware that as well as getting that, they should also be told officially by the local authority that they're not going to issue a plan, and that instead they are issuing this, because you are still entitled to a right of appeal, and that's quite important just to say that. So you can appeal that as well. Okay, so the final plan should be issued within 4 weeks of the draft plan. Sometimes this happens, sometimes it might not. It should name the placement or at the very least the type of placement. So sometimes people have found that if there's not a space in their choice of school, they might be put on a waiting list, and the local authority, for example, they might name specialist provision on the EHC plan until that place is available, and then they will add that on later. So sometimes that does happen. And you have a right to appeal at this stage. So you can appeal a lack of specificity, you can appeal the contents, you can appeal the placement at this stage as well. And if you did get to this stage, I would advise you contact us if you need some advice about that. And this just goes through the sections. So basically it's written out in a certain way, and these slides just help you understand which each section means. So section A covers the views and interests of the child or young person and their parents. It's got to be clear, and the views of the parent and professional must be in there as well. So that's section A. Section B must cover the special educational needs. And now we say to many callers that call in, section B and section F are very important, because B has the needs, F has the provision. Okay, so if you feel like there's anything, a glaring thing missing that you think is an important factor for your child's education, then it's really important to you know, have a good combing over of this section. Okay, and it must be specified as well. Sections C and D are healthcare needs. So C is the needs, and section D is social care needs. So C is health, D is social care. And so sometimes for some people, they might not have that much written in these sections. If there's not a need for it, that's okay. And then other cases that there's, you know, a lot in these sections. So it just depends on that. Section E must cover the outcomes sought for the child or young person. And these are reviewed when the EHC plan is reviewed. And the EHC plan will be reviewed annually, and you will become familiar with that process once you have an EHC plan. But that's another thing for another day. I think that's another topic, annual reviews. Okay, so these are what's reviewed in the school and college annual reviews. Section F must cover the special educational needs provision, and they must be detailed, they must be specific, and they must be quantified in terms of the type of provision, how many hours of it is needed, the frequency of it, and as Ehcp say, it's no good saying regular, because Halley's Comet is regular, and so it's got to be, it's got to say how often it's the provision is implemented and who's doing it. So you've very much got to think who, what, where, how long. Those sorts of questions.
It's the should and the must, isn't it? It's the weasel words.
It's the weasel words. So what you don't want to see is as required. And however, I would say, just in their defence a little bit, is that sometimes that is appropriate. So, for example, if you have like a child that's using a wheelchair, for example, if it says in their EHC plan, if the occupational therapist has said, you know, it must be ensured that the child is readjusted in their seating in the wheelchair, that is as and when required. So obviously there are some things that it is suitable for, but you know, things like speech and language as required, that's not really good enough. It needs to say who's doing it, where is it being done, how often is it being done, and how long are the sessions. Okay, so that it removes any doubt. Sections G and H, healthcare provision, and section H1 and H2, so social care provision required under the CSDPA. I don't even know what that stands for, do you?
I don't know.
Yes. I think social care. Okay. So essentially though, earlier on, it was C and D was social care needs was section C. Section D was social care needs. C, healthcare, D, social care. And then G and H are like the provision for social care, healthcare needs. And section H1 is am I right? You've got B and F is the general needs and the general provision. C and D, C is health needs and D is social care needs. And then G is the provision for the healthcare needs, and then H is the provision for social care needs. That's what it is. But you can see why parents get confused, because you've got the needs in one place and the provision in another.
I found out what CSPDA is, and it's
something to do with social care.
Not terribly cheerful.
Oh,
it's the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act.
Okay. So, but it's essentially social care provision that's recommended after the assessment when it's determined what the social care needs are, and the social care needs are back in section D. Okay, so it's helpful having a guide like this. Also, EHC produced one as well that you can look up. Section I is the placement, so that will be where the school is written down. Section J is where there's a personal budget. Now, again, this is another rabbit warren. It's really only when you're thinking of getting involved with the provision yourself. So if there is a provision that is recommended in the EHC plan and nobody else seems to be able to source the right thing, and you've been able to source the right thing, you can ask the local authority to give you a personal budget, which is a breakdown of how they spend the money, and you can, off the back of that, request a direct payment. But that is a subject for another time, definitely. Section K, the advice and information gathered during the needs assessment. And we're nearly there. Now, the Sen Tribunal. So this is where you would go if you don't agree with the EHC plan. It's an independent body that hears the case of the family, of the young person, the child, against any decisions made by the local authority. So for most appeals, the parents or young person must consider the mediation process, which is what I mentioned earlier, and they will need a certificate from mediation to go further onto appeal, which is what I mentioned earlier as well. Parents and young people have 2 months to lodge an appeal after receiving their decision letter. So if they get their EHC plan and they're not happy with it, they're not happy with the placement on it, then you can request a mediation meeting, and you might even want to go on to appeal. What I would say is probably best to give us a ring and we can explain it in more detail to you. But essentially, you do have the opportunity to challenge the decision, either the contents of the plan or the placement of the plan. Okay? And that's it really. So the process is a detailed review. The assessment itself is a detailed review of a child's or a young person's special educational needs and disability. An EHC plan, education, health and care plan, may be produced at the end of the process. And the parents or young person have the right of appeal to the Sen Tribunal at a number of stages. So that is, if they decide not to do an assessment, you can appeal that. If they decide to not issue a plan, you can appeal that. And if you're not happy with the plan, you can appeal that. Okay, and I would suggest, if you're not sure, call Hampshire SENDIASS. That's what I would say.
Liz, that's a really comprehensive session. Thank you. And so much information. And it's brilliant that we've got this recorded because people can go back through it. Because, as we keep saying, there are so many rabbit holes. And different people, you know, can fall down different ones and need support and help along the way. And absolutely everybody who's on the call is going to have a different EHCP and a different situation.
Well, that's the thing at the end of the day. That's why it's good to use the services like Hampshire SENDIASS. You can phone up our triage, you know, helpline and speak to somebody, because every case is different and there is no one size fits all. really, at the end of the day. So call us anytime and we will happily, hopefully, help you.
Absolutely. And SENDIASS, they're there to provide you support with the actual process. I also want to give a shout out for our HPCN get-togethers, which can provide you with some peer support, because going through this process is horrible. And Liz has made a big point about treating it like almost like an academic exercise.
It is a process. Yeah.
But if you come along to our get-togethers, there are other people going through this with you. And I've had a mum there who's saying she's going through this with a preschooler. I actually run a get together now for under fives, which is lovely, because if you have a diagnosis before school, or even just know about needs before school, you could be doing EHCP before you get to that point with school. But have a look on our on the HPCN page. Our events are there, and you can join a get together either close to you. I mean, you can join one far away as well if you want, but you can join a get together and you will find other parents who are going through this process. And it's just really nice to know that you're not going through it on your own, because it isn't a nice process, but it is a worthwhile process.
Yeah, it is. So I don't know if anybody wants to ask me anything, or of course you can contact us at Hampshire SENDIASS through the helpline.
There's lots and lots of information I've popped in the chat today. If you want to save that, you can. I know on my laptop there's 3 little buttons and you can just click the chat. Otherwise, I tend to drop all these links into my HPCN group, which is the Heart and Rushmore one. It's HPCN Heart and Rushmore Share Together, which you are very welcome to join.
Can I just say, Sarah, sorry, one quick thing. I just wanted to say that Hampshire SENDIASS are impartial as well. It's really important to say that we are impartial. We aren't on anybody's side, and it's a confidential service, so we won't contact anybody without your permission, and it's also free of charge. So it's an 0800 number.
I've got one question that I want to pop in, but I'm also conscious of time, largely because I'm the one who has to shoot off and collect my daughter, because their school day now finishes at 2:30. If you don't get an EHCP after appeal, can you reapply? I don't know the answer to that.
I do, and the answer is, if you have been through the assessment process, then you have to wait, I want to say, I thought it was 12 months, so it might be 6 months, but there is a time frame. You do have to wait before reapplying if you've been through an assessment. But if you haven't been through an assessment, so they've decided, no, we think school can meet needs at the moment, or there's not enough evidence, they decide not to do an assessment, then you can reapply pretty much any time. But obviously it would be a bit silly to do it straight away, because you'd need to gather the evidence up first. But there isn't a time limit in that situation.
Okay, super.
Okay,
so a massive thanks to Liz for her time today. I've learned things, despite Liz thinking I'm a veteran of this process. I've learned things I didn't know, so that's fantastic.
Well, I'm always learning as well. There's always a call that I can't answer, and I'm going to go off now, and I'm going to go off and look up whether it's 6 months or 12 months now before you can replay.
Always more to learn. We will get the recording up on our social media channels, I would imagine, by about the end of Monday. It's always watched by lots and lots of people after the event, so that we know that these sessions are really, really useful. And do come along to our get-togethers, because you can both gain from other people, but you can help other people further down the line from you, and that's a really worthwhile thing to do as well. I hope everyone has a good weekend. I'm hoping it warms up a bit, because I'm freezing. And best of luck to you on your EHCP journeys.
Okay, good stuff.
I'm going to stop the recording.